Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. I am Abe with MysticGenMara.com, a small town mystic from the middle of Idaho. And tonight, let's go back into the world of the Wiccan religion. We started off last week kind of where it came from, some of the basic tenets, nothing too intense, nothing too deep. We can go deeper if you guys are interested. Let me know in the comments or the chat. But for now, we're just kind of doing some basic stuff. And where we ended last week was after we went through some of the general equipment, not always things that are absolutely necessary, but some of the basics. And the last part we were discussing was the Book of Shadows, which was the Wiccan training manual, text manual, how the traditions are carried forward till today. Now that we have looked over some of the basics of rituals, and I mean very basic, nothing super intense, and the general tools that you would use, there are two primary traditions, and that's where we've come to this episode in particular, is the primary two lines that have the origins of modern day Wicca, and those are Gardenian and Alexandrian witchcraft. Gardenian Wiccans group, Gardenian Wiccan groups are divided into covens of approximately at maximum 13 members. You can have down to about 9, but the maximum is 13. It's not always the case. They would prefer it to always be 13, at least an odd number. That way, if there's any disagreements, they can be settled by vote. But in the founding tradition that Gerald Gardner started, 13 was the number that he wanted. In these covens, the high priestess is generally the highest position in the coven, and she will generally select her high priest from the trained men of the coven. The men have to be trained in all the rituals. They have to be initiated at least into the second degree, if not the third, for them to be considered trained enough to be taking the position of the high priest in the original covens. They then will lead rituals within the group, and that is something that the priestess and the high priestess and the high priest, they are the officiators. They're the ones that do the hand fastings. We'll get into those possibly in another video, but they're the ones that do the full moon rituals, the new moon rituals, the Sabbath rituals. They're the ones that lead things. Now, when I say lead, they're the ones that set things up, get things moving. Every person in a coven has a part to play, whether that's minor or major. It's not like when you go to most churches where there's a person that stands up front, maybe 3 or 4. Someone does a song service, someone does special music or kids story, then you have the pastor who does the sermon, you have an elder or deacon or something along those lines that leads a prayer or some Bible readings. You have like 5 or 6 people who are active. Everyone else is very passive, and they sit there and they, say their part and sing, pray, kneel, stand, whatever, as directed. Not so in a coven. Every person participates. It's not a matter of one person chattering away. We all in a coven, and I use the term we as in everyone in the group, participates. There's no separation. The high priestess and the high priest lead, keep things moving, direct traffic, so to speak. But all members of a coven are active. In the coven, the high priestess represents the goddess incarnate. So it's when she is in the circle within the ritual space, she is the representation, the voice of the mother goddess. The high priest is the representation of the god incarnate. He is the voice of the god. So you have the Lord and Lady within the coven representing the Lord and Lady in the galaxy. So pretty important roles, and that's why you have to be pretty well trained to achieve those titles. And it's not something that I'm going to strive and I'm going to be that person. Not the best way to go about it. You want to do this to build a relationship, because when you are in those positions, you truthfully are the representation of the divine manifest. You are an example to those in the coven as to the face of the divine. You can train and you can have that drive to become, but do it for the right reasons, because that position is a very strong connection to God, Source, Divine, and that's what the goal is in spirituality, is to connect to the divine. So, I'll split pages here. You must be initiated to learn deeper rites and rituals. There were oaths of secrecy in the original covens, and they still carry through to today. It's not as big of a deal, but it was during this time period. So secrecy was to protect members of the coven, and the oaths of secrecy were, in a lot of cases, pretty severe. Even in Gardner's time, you didn't want to break those oaths. Sometimes you would be given a coven, and within a coven you'd be giving a secret coven-only name. In the beginning of the covens, some people couldn't have their spiritual practices get out to their families or employers. Some of the things that happened to some of the original witches when they did get outed weren't always the greatest. You could be kicked out of your family, you could be fired from your job, you'd be ostracized, like big red or big black dot on your forehead, don't hire that person. Not the best options, not literal black dot, not in the last 150 years, but it was like you were ostracized. So secrecy in the original groups, especially around Gardner's time, was very important, which is why he got a lot of flack from other coven members, because he went very public with a fair amount. Not all of it, by the way, just enough to make people be like, seriously? But that also goes back to like Mathers and Woodman and Westcott. Those guys had to be careful too. Some of them were a bit more open than others with their spiritual proclivities, but it's never been something that has been truthfully open to everybody in this world, because this kind of stuff tends to threaten the powers that be, so they don't like that. But the funny part is when you study into this, it's actually puts all of the responsibility for life on you and your connection, which is a little bit different than what some of the other beliefs are out there. But this was originally some of the reasons for the secrecy. Today, it's way less disastrous if people find out that you're a practicing Wiccan or something like that. But for personal reasons, there are still a lot of people out there that will rely on secrecy because they don't want everybody to know that that's what they're doing, because there's still a lot of bad memories, a lot of it's blood memories, that they don't want to bring that forward because they have this memory of a past time when it was very toxic or very dangerous to be open about this. The secrecy helps to keep a coven safe and the teachings safe, secure, and one of the references I found said to keep the teachings pure. To a point, I agree, because the more people want to add to something, the more diluted it becomes, the less pure it actually is. So, with this secrecy, it also allows it also allows for a more continuous line of practice. If you are initiated into a coven, you will work through that coven's book of shadows. You will be getting information from that line within the coven's tradition. And there are various hive-offs that will lead you back to the original group. The original group for pretty much all of the covens today, I say pretty much because not all of them trace, but almost all of the modern day ones, if you start tracking back, will take you back to Gerald Gardner. So it's pretty interesting how one man's obsession with spirituality and the occult changed the course of history, really, especially in the spiritual traditions. And as I've stated before, Gardner's original design for a coven had 3 initiation levels or grades. There are those who claim that the first 2 levels are based on the first 2 levels in Masonic rites. I cannot confirm or deny that. Gardner was at one point a fringe member, I guess you could say, of the Masonic groups. But from my understanding, of Gardner's work and the Masonic Lodge's first 10 degrees, the public order you could call it, there's some similarities, but you could also say the same about any initiation practices, because they're all, the first few levels are always pretty similar. Gardner's covens generally worshipped the horned god and the mother goddess, similar to Cernunnos and a lot of the modern day depictions of Gaia as a pregnant mother. Those are kind of the concepts that they were going with. I didn't find any really good pictures that weren't, copyright claimed, so I just kind of skipped that one tonight. There were specific names in the original coven, which, interestingly enough, weren't really released until later, and then it was kind of released as an accident, which makes some people think those were not the original names in Gardner's covens for the Lord and the Lady, but you can pick and choose on that. One of the later high priestesses, Doreen Valiente, said there were actually more than one set of names that you could use within the original covens. And in my experience over the years of studying this group amongst others, there are a lot of variations that you can use, and we'll get into a little bit more of that later, but for now, understand that you can just go simply the Lord and Lady, the Goddess and the God, but there's a lot of other names you can use. So, with that, when we get into the coven, as I described in the last one, the long form Wiccan read gives you a lot of information, but there was a shorter version that some people call the Wiccan Law. It's still in a lot of places called the Wiccan Read. Sorry, I even had coffee this afternoon. I'm not sure what my problem is. And as I said, we went over the long form version in the last video. In this one, the basic Wiccan Read, or the Wiccan Law, if you will, is summed up with the following rhyme. And it's, "Bide the Wiccan Read ye must, in perfect love and perfect trust. These 8 words the read fulfill, and harm ye none, do what ye wilt. Ever mind the rule of 3, what you sends out comes back to thee. Follow this with mind and heart, merry meet and merry part." That is the summation of what the Wiccan Read really states. It's also the law upon how a person who is in a Wiccan group, a witch group, coven, is to act. You're abiding, in other words, you're following the Wiccan Read, the laws of the Wiccan Read, which we discussed in the last video. You're doing so in perfect love and perfect trust. You can't hold deceit in front of the God and the Goddess, the Lord and Lady. How are you supposed to hide something from the creators of the universe? Fair point, right? And when you're in a coven, you want to trust the people you're with. You also want to love them, agape sense, so that you guys can grow and build and develop. That allows that relationship within the coven to grow, but it also allows the relationship between the practitioner and the divine. So you're building a lot of that relationship in perfect love and perfect trust. These 8 words the read fulfill, harm ye none, do what you will. It sounds like you're given a blank check, do whatever you want. Not in the slightest. And harm ye none is the key aspect. Whatever you do it to the highest ethical standard. You do it to the highest moral compass. And if you follow that, do whatever you want. But when you do that, you're not hurting anybody else. You're not hurting yourself either. You're not doing things to intentionally go after someone else. Revenge is harm. Don't know why that has to be said, but you'd be surprised, especially in, and I'm not saying this to be knocking any one group, but in Christian groups, they will hear phrases like harm ye none, do what you will, and they're like, oh, that just means you can do whatever you want. See, that is an evil thing. No. That is the definition of what Christianity is based on. You're not harming other people. You are following the commandments of God, which the 10 commandments are pretty simple. Quit messing around. Don't hurt people. There's 10 simple rules. Why is that so hard? And in the Wiccan groups, same concept. You're not out there to harm other people. Now, there are groups out there that use magic for negative purposes. That's where we get into ever mind the rule of 3. The law of 3, the law of karma, if you will. What you send out comes back to thee. Whenever you do anything, the threefold law, and we'll define this a little bit more here in a second, means you put out good, you get threefold back. You put out evil, well, you're going to get 3 of those back. So, and there's other versions of it as well, and like I said, I'll break that down here in a second. But you want to make sure you're harming no one and doing positive, uplifting, supportive things. Tough love is a gray area in this aspect. But it's also a gray area in every other world religion, so it's not just in Wicca. Follow this with mind and heart, merry meet and merry part. You're doing this not just here. It's not an intellectual practice. There are people who have taken all religion, Wicca included, and made it into an intellectual exercise. I'm not sure how you do that and build anything, really, because yeah, you can break it down. You can analyze this till the cows come home, but then you just have cows that are smart. What's the point? And when you're mixing the mind and the heart, you're taking the analytics, the processes of a ritual, which is the mind part, but you're building it into a heart. That's the relationship. Follow the read with mind and heart. You're taking the rituals, you're taking the base principles, the tenets, the rules, so to speak, and you're applying them to your life, but you're using that as a way to open the doorway for communication between you and the divine. It's a deepening of the relationship. Merry meet and merry part. You're joining a group for the pleasure of the group, for the connection to source. You're coming into a circle. It doesn't mean you have to be bubbly and happy all the time, but you're doing this out of the joy of communion with others and communion with the divine. And when you're done, you take that joy with you. You take that peace, that love, that connection with you out into the world. You spread your light that you build in the circle. That's the basics of the Wiccan law, which is a short form version. And I did put links in the description. Let me double check that. For if you're interested in just like a basic sheet version of that. Yes, I did. Because they are cool to have. Like I said, I have one that literally goes with me everywhere. It actually stays right next to my Bible, which is funny. But they have a lot of good in both, and that's why I carry both of them around. Because a lot of the stuff today is not based on anything of what the origins were. So yeah, go with that. So in the original one, the long form, which was in the last video, it goes over the basics of how to perform a ritual, basic tools, and the concepts wrapped up within. There are enough basics within the Wiccan Read that you can build rituals and celebrations to your heart's content. It's pretty cool that you can sum an entire religion into a single page poem. but you can, and that's the Wiccan Read. In the description, you can check those out. They're like $2 or $3. They're worth adding to a collection, and they're nice enough. If you chose to frame them, you could. I keep mine in the original plastic. Like I said, they stay with some of my other very important documents with certain other spiritual books. So the law of three, or the threefold law, is the golden rule, if we're going to use the Christian terms, of Matthew 7 verse 12. I actually put a bookmark in. It's right here. And it is, therefore, whatever you want men to do to you, do also unto them, for this is the law and the prophets. So that's the biblical version of the golden rule. I went to set that down and it about crashed, so moved it. The Wiccans just take this a little bit further. And from my experience, the Wiccan concept is a bit more accurate in its practice. Whatever you send out into the universe, whatever it is, good, bad, neutral, you will get that back in sets of 3. If you do good, it comes back times 3. If you do bad, it comes back times 3. It adds a little bit of weight to the phrase, and harm you none, do what you wilt. Because if you're doing something to benefit yourself, to others, healing, money, whatever, and you always put the caveat, this or something better, with harm to no one. That way, when you're putting your intention out there, you're saying to the universe, this is what I'm looking for, this is what I'm doing this ritual for, this is what I'm lighting this candle for. I don't want anyone else to get hurt in this. I just want this to be open, the pathway to be cleared for me, show me the next steps, fill in the blank. Putting those extra words in there, it's more for you, not the universe. They already know what they're doing. It's so that you know that whatever's coming in isn't harming someone else. It's a good practice to get into if you're deciding to go down the path of the Wiccan path, I should say. This particular spiritual guide allows each initiate to discover their own experience from the greater mysteries. The basics of the rituals allow for a pretty broad range of variances of experience, even of the same 13 people within a circle. You can have a lot of different experiences. Wicca doesn't want blind followers. There's a few other people out there that say that too, and we'll talk about them later. They want open thinkers. They give you an outline. Here's the base ritual. And then they hand you the crayons. You get to fill it in. It's beautiful when you get to have some of these experiences. Personally, I have not been involved in a group, so my experiences have all been solitary, but that doesn't negate the beauty and at times intensity of these type of experiences. The structure of the ritual is to set up the individual to have their own experience in a loving and trusting, safe environment. That's the purpose of the Wiccan circle and the rituals, is to build that love, that trust, so you can open yourself up to the divine in its purest form. Orthodox dogma is not a standard practice of coven environments. They don't teach you what to think. That's not how a coven works. They show you a way to connect to the divine and find the answers. Because I don't care what church, coven, group you go to. If they're telling you this is the only way because we said so, this is what you think because we said so, you might want to rethink that situation. Even in the biblical sense, this is the path, but you still have your own personality and ideas and thoughts. This is the way spirituality works. People who tell you that you're not allowed to think for yourself, you're getting closer to the idea of a cult, and that's something you should run away from as fast as you possibly can. Gardner, going back a little bit here, was initiated into the New Forest clan. This very secretive coven, according to Gardner, taught him most of what he would later call Wicca when he developed his witchcraft groups. Due to his vows of secrecy, he couldn't tell anyone about what he found out and what he learned. Like, witchcraft was alive and thriving in secret in England. Over time, because he was a wily old guy, he was able to convince the high priestess of his group to allow him to write a fictionalized account of witchcraft and coven work. This book was originally published under the title High Magic's Aid. If you're interested, it's in the description. And the reason I put them in the description, the books that I talk about through here, is so that I make it easier for you. Some of these things are pretty easy to find. Other ones, you're like, is this the one or is this the one? Because you'd be surprised how many books with the same name are out there. I put links there to help you guys find them easier, to find the ones that are actually the ones I'm talking about. So, there you go. Thankfully, the witchcraft laws that kept people in fear in England, especially, were repealed in the early 1950s. Thank everything that is holy. This allowed Gardner to publish his first non-fiction work called, where'd it go? Witchcraft Today. I have a very old school version of this book because the new one's not as purple or beat up as mine. This publication brought the old religion into the light of modern day. Some of the other coven members were very mad to the point of furious about Gerald publishing this work. He did defend himself well, from what I have found, by saying that the covens were dying and he was trying to save the craft. I don't know about the first part where the covens were dying, but he did save the craft of the wise. Gerald fleshed out rituals, filled in the blanks that he found within theology. He also initiated a high priestess named Doreen Valiente, who wrote much of the poetic wording within his rituals. Verses said in rhyme stick with the mind, make it easier to repeat and memorize, and there's something about the sing-songy wording of poetry that puts us in a divine mindset. If you look at hymnals in a lot of Christian churches, there's rhythmic patterns and rhyming phrases. It's pretty common, and religion has known this for years. All spiritual groups know this. They just don't want you to know that they know. So a lot of what Doreen Valiente wrote is pretty good. I mean, she has some of her stuff's in here. So, like I said, it's worth checking out if you're interested in that kind of stuff. And from a musical or poetic sense, it's pretty fascinating to see how they put some of these concepts into the phrasing. So, I mean, even from a literature perspective, it's fun to read. Gardner taught that humans' deep power was more easily accessed when the body was unencumbered by clothing. And I talked about this in my discussion on Gerald Gardner. In other words, in his mind, the best magic was performed sky-clad, or for the uninitiated, naked, no clothes, nudie, running around sans everything. He believed in going back to his biography, that clothing was what led a lot of us to health issues. So to prevent his asthma, he decided to be a nudist for more often than he wore clothes. Supposedly it worked. His asthma settled down. I cannot confirm nor deny that was part of his beliefs. Then you also include dancing would be performed, and this was to raise power, to add to the rituals, to send out the healings, to work the magics. They would also use things such as binding. Some of the more modern concepts of binding within coven work, and I'm not talking about other things, would be to bind around the chakra areas gently, just a little bit of pressure type thing. And I'm not personally comfortable with this, but the claim is that it actually helps to awaken the chakra's energy. Okay, you're not tying me up. And then there's also the concept of scourging, where you would lightly whip yourself, cat o' nine tails, like the nice ones, not the wicked ones. We'll just leave that there, but that was something that they would use in some of the original covens to build energy for ritual practice. And during that time, it was while Gerald was living on the Isle of Man that the modern views of the Wheel of the Year were further defined and brought into the modern world. The 8 Sabbats that we talk about a lot today were fixed by date by Gerald and his coven, and a lot of the more beautiful rituals were designed at that time. And to be perfectly honest, it's from a lot of his work and some of his direct line descendants that influence how I view the Sabbats, and the guided visualizations that I offer on here during those times. A lot of it is my views or interpretations of a lot of the stuff that they originally designed. When I'm doing a guided visualization, I want to bring in to the circle in physical form the Lord and Lady so that we can interact, and that's why I word them the way I do. But it was Gerald Gardner and his groups that really started to set things up properly. The 8 Sabbats go back significantly further, but locking them into this to the more structured date system that we use today was something that he did and his group. Gerald's coven and writings influenced other leaders in the craft. The 2 biggest names descended from Gerald. Well, there's actually 3 names, but it's one married couple and another single person. Not single, but individual. And that is Alex and Maxine Sanders, Alexandrian Witchcraft, and Raymond Buckland. All I'm going to say about Raymond at this point is he brought Gerald's craft to the United States in 1964, and eventually he would build his own line out of Gerald's coven foundation, but he still linked back to Gerald. Gerald actually helped train him. So, like I said, we'll go over Raymond later, because he's another one that has done a lot of inspiration to how I view things in this culture. Alex and Maxine, on the other hand, took Gardner's work and then adapted it for their personal interests. That changed the path of Gerald's original groups into what we would now call Alexandrian witchcraft. Alex Sanders, known as the King of Witches, and his wife, the Queen of Witches, took Gardner's work and expanded it in a way that at the time people were a little bit surprised by. Today it's kind of common to mix like this, but at that time it was a little surprising. Alex added aspects of ceremonial magic, magic with a K, not illusionary magic, and the Holy Kabbalah. These are 2 things that interested Alex for years. He'd been studying them, and to those who knew Alex and then later on Maxine, it was kind of an obvious thing that he would incorporate those practices, but at the time it was a little bit surprising to other members who weren't as familiar with Alex. From this inclusion, the growth of the coven and tradition expanded well beyond Britain. Over time, the tradition Alex started, Alexandrian witchcraft, expanded to a large portion of the Western world. Canada, Ireland, Portugal, United States, just to name a few. The list was pretty extensive, honestly. We'll just stick with those. With the basics of the goddess and the god worship in the rituals, there were other aspects of the Kabbalah, and weirdly enough, because this was something that the Golden Dawn incorporated, and you don't see too many people poking at this stick with this particular stuff with a stick, but Alex did, and that are notes of Enochian magic were added into the mix. I want to do later on a 3-part series on Enochian magic, the founders, the base concepts, where it comes from, and then kind of go through where we start to where we are today. And the reason I say it's a little bit weird that he would add this into Wiccan rituals, and why would you poke it with a stick? As much as published about Enochian magic, the knowledge of what it actually is and does is minimal. Unlike other forms of ritual work, that one's unique. There's a lot of people who say, I know everything there is. No, they don't. Because the people who got it weren't allowed to use it. It was actually locked away for years, and it wasn't started to really come into a functional work until the Golden Dawn, Crowley, and that group. But even them, they weren't fully aware of the full power of this. People today still study it. There's books written about it all the time. I can't remember if it was Crowley or Rigardi. One of them made a comment about the Enochian magic is powerful enough on 2 dimensions, flat paper, because someone was trying to make a 3-dimensional rendering. They're like, no, not into third. This is powerful enough as it is. What you're doing, we don't even know how far this will go. So even amongst seasoned practitioners, Enochian magic is a mystery unto itself. Like I said, we'll go over that later. But it was just kind of an odd thing as I was going through the research with Alex that he just added this in. He may have been studying under some of these other people, and that's fine, but that one was a little bit of a slap upside the head, like, why would you add that? Anywho, back to the story. Alex's tradition continued to grow and evolve until his passing. Even after his passing, his wife Maxine, who's interestingly still alive, is still practicing today. So that's really cool as far as I'm concerned. Alex would prefer to dictate the Book of Shadows versus letting the initiate copy it like tradition dictated. This led to a few variations of the Book of Shadows over the years. From what I have found, not massive variations, but variations nonetheless. So someone who studied under Alex in, say, 1969-70 would have a slightly different version of the Book of Shadows than someone who studied with him in like 77. So, but the variations did not weaken the Alexandrian covens. So, just like Gardner's covens, Alex's covens met on full moons, the 8 primary Sabbats, and the new moons for various rituals and practices. As with Gerald's group, Alex continued on with 3 grades or degrees within his coven system as well. Interestingly enough, Alex borrowed a belief that only a witch can make a witch. So you basically had to join a coven to accept or use the name witch or Wiccan. To be honest, it's a good practice in theory, especially during that time period. But in the world we live in today, there are solitary practitioners that claim the title witch, and they are just as knowledgeable as people who are trained in a coven. I'm not talking, and I'm going to be very specific here, and you can leave whatever comments you want as long as we're respectful. And I'm not talking about the rando wannabe spellcasters that are trying to use magic to get revenge or cast a spell on that person that they want to fall in love with, but they don't actually have a spiritual connection to the divine. I'm not talking about those people when I say solitary practitioner. Those people are not in line with the ethics and morals of Wicca and Wiccan witchcraft. There are things that make a witch a witch. These include a primary focus on the worship of the Lord and Lady, finding the balance within the magic, and magic in a lot of situations was a side note. Not saying that they don't do it. Don't get me wrong. That is kind of a big part of it. But it's not the primary focus in most ritual work. the main focus is connecting with the divine, the relationship with the divine, and that building of that connection. The solitary or eclectic witch or Wicca still finds basis in one of these two lines, Alexandrian or Gardenian. Either through books, training in a coven in which they've stepped away from. Most people in the solitary or eclectic circles trace their line or knowledge, traditional path, back to Gerald Gardner or Alex Sanders. Like I said, with minimal exceptions, everything goes back through those two. There has been a craving for this particular connection that a 13-member coven could not fulfill. People were wanting it faster than people could be trained to hive off to start new covens. So in the 1970s, much larger groups, up to 150, 200 people, had started to pop up. Not fully traditional in the literal sense of 13-member covens, but the members of the coven would still participate in the same rituals. There would just be more attendees, less active participants. Some of these gatherings would be called camps and workshops. Some were one-day events, some were over a 3-day weekend. It's a pretty cool idea. And no, I've not had the privilege of attending one. Most of them are in the East Coast or down south because I live in Hell's Back Door with the freezing right now. So there's that. The more solitary path has always been more of an interest to me. And a lot of it's just, I've seen some interesting things happen in groups, and so I'm just more preferred to stay alone. Not so much Wiccan groups, just religious groups in general. So my life's been fairly solitary in that aspect. The eclectic groups have helped bring in other ideas to the craft. It is the eclectic thought that brought in the other aspects of the divine, not just the standard ones that Gerald Gardner and Alex Sanders used. In other words, this was the introduction of the new covens, introducing the Greek-style covens, where they only worship the Greek deities, Egyptian-style covens, where they worship the Egyptian deities. There are even some that incorporate Jewish and or Christian ideas into the rituals. I'm not exactly sure how I feel about this. It's not something that I personally am okay with. Yes, I compare the two frequently. But certain beliefs should stick with certain groups. Like, you wouldn't go into a Christian church and start hailing Zeus. That is weird. So why would you take theirs and bring it into yours? Like I said, I'm not sure how I feel about it. I don't fully agree with that concept, but there are groups out there, and that's what they want to do. That's for them. I will point out that there are naysayers. Of course there are. There always is. That claim that solitary or at-home practitioners are victims of consumerism. Yes, because you didn't have a say when you bought that book, did you? And I can see where some people would think that. There's a bazillion books out there on Wicca, witchcraft, pick your vein. But the solitary witch, in true spirit, buys books and studies and trains from those texts. Just because you buy a book or a tarot deck does not mean you're a witch or a Wiccan. Most people own a Bible. That doesn't really mean they're Christian either. It is the relationship with the divine that equals the title, be it Wiccan or Christian. I own a lot of books on a lot of subjects. Would I claim title to any of them? Hell no. I'm saying that to be blunt and honest. But do I claim to be a spiritual person in connection with the divine? Yes. I don't really claim titles because to me it's just not my personality. I don't like putting labels on everything. A lot of things need labels. Personally, not interested. But the big point is, and I've met some really amazing Christian people over the years, and you can tell by their fruits you shall know them, biblical term. you can tell that they are connected. They have a relationship with God, Jesus, Mother Mary, whichever denomination you're with. You can tell. I have met far too many who claim the title Christian. I'm a Christian, I do this. But then when you watch how they act, I would be surprised if they even knew what God was if God walked in the door. And I'm not being rude. By your fruits you shall know, by their fruits you shall know them. It's obvious. The same thing with a Wiccan. A true Wiccan or true witch under these covens is going to follow a set moral code. Now, does that mean that they're going to be love and light and bubbles and unicorn farts all the time? No. Tough love is an aspect of spirituality. That's just a true statement. But if they're claiming one thing, but their actions are completely opposed to that, or the majority of their life, you would question what they believe, it takes away from the title, and that's the part where the naysayers are like, oh, they're just doing it because they're victims of consumerism. Shut up. If you truly want the deepening of your spiritual life, you're going to take what's in those books and you're going to take it to the next level. You're going to study, you're going to practice. It's going to become a living thing for you to the point where you don't need the book anymore. That's the purpose of spirituality. And that's the reason I don't agree with the naysayers. There are people out there who just buy the books because, look, I have all these books and I do these things. Okay. When was the last time you did a full moon ritual? Oh, I don't do that. Then how do you call yourself a Wiccan? You know, it's like the people who practice pick your name for the concept of yoga today. Good Lord, there's a lot of them. Oh, I'm a yoga fill in the blank. I do this all the time, blah, blah, blah. And then they turn around and stab people in the back. They do lower chakra stuff that's negative chakra energy. And you're like, yoga can just be physical exercise, but are you bringing in the spiritual practice? You claim to, but then your actions don't show it. So it is the relationship to the divine. It is the connection to source. It is that flow of spiritual energy that allows you to actually be known by what you're talking about. And that's where, like I said, the naysayers aren't completely wrong. They blanket statement everybody. And I'm saying there are people in both camps in literally every path out there. So, sorry. Side notes have been bad today. Some of the more modern day witches that I will say are absolutely amazing in what they teach and how they bring it forward are Silver Ravenwolf and the now passed over Scott Cunningham. Matter of fact, Scott Cunningham passed away in the 90s, I believe. Might have been a little bit earlier than that. I do want to do a discussion on him, but he's another one that I'm going to have to put some time into because he was a very unique person in a lot of ways. Cunningham was focused on the teachings of the craft, more so for the solitary practitioner than the group. He did talk in some of his works about group stuff, but for the most part it was the solitary. He did a solitary manual, which I put in the description, and then he also published his public book of shadows, and that's this guy here. And he goes through places to perform magic rituals, full moon rituals. I have to say, I love the way Scott does stuff, because he always puts in recipes, and then he ties the recipes to the holiday. Cardamom apple pie for Samhain and Yule celebrations. There are prayers, there are invocations. He has his version of the Wiccan. He calls it the rune. Just a second here. Oh yes, this is actually the Wiccan rune, not so much the reed. And so he actually, in this particular book, this is a lot of his notes. They reference where he put this in other publications. So if you're wanting to pick something up about Scott and just kind of get the basics of what his practices were, this guy right here is the good one. Yeah, I'm a book nerd, so I am all about the physical books. The other reason I like physical books, and I didn't do it in this book, weirdly enough, but I tend to put footnotes. I put little sticky notes on the side so my books look like they're growing, to remember different concepts, ideas, whatever I was working on. He talks about solitary practices for Beltane, like forming a circle of stones, doing dances, different chantings you can do. So this one is something that a lot of people never thought would get published because he talked about it in his lifetime, but Llewellyn, with some other people that Scott was working with, finally were allowed to publish this work. Highly recommend it. It is definitely worth it. Just the knowledge, and he does everything for a small group, 1 or 2 people, or for the solitary. So it's been simplified so you don't need 4 people at the 4 quarters doing invocations. 1 person can do it in their living room. So it's, like I said, for small groups it's really handy, or for individuals. Where am I at? There we are. Sorry. Silver Ravenwolf is still alive, still practicing, I believe, in Pennsylvania. Her beliefs have grown over the years. I think I have every single thing she's ever published, and that's not a brag. It's just I like how she writes, and she writes so you can understand really complicated ideas and theological concepts. She writes them in a way that's easier to understand, at least for me. Scott writes for the individual, so does Silver. She still is writing. She's an amazing witch who does live her path every single day. She has many books, as I said, about the craft. The one that I will say is probably the best all-in-one resource for her work is her Book of Shadows for the Solitary Witch. It's linked below. It is a massive book. It's like 2 inches thick or something. It's 600 or 700 pages. It's got descriptions. It has a concordance of correspondence, colors, days of the week, moon signs, planetary alignments, different rituals. There's base level spells. There's invocations for different deities. There's even how to practice from a bedroom where you don't want your neighbors, your roommates knowing what you're doing. And in a lot of ways, and people will have criticized her for this, it comes off simple. One of the terms I've heard, and I don't agree with this in the slightest about her work because I've read enough of it, they call her Fluffy Bunny. No, not true, not in the slightest. She wants you to be able to understand these concepts and be able to practice them pretty much from day one. She gives you options, she gives you ideas. She doesn't really force what she talks about on other people. If you ask, here you go. And I've watched some interviews with her. She is amazing. She's one that if I ever got the chance to go to a public event, I would do it in a heartbeat. She's just got a really cool energy to her. And you can take any of her teachings, because she writes them easy to understand, easy to start to practice, but you can literally take them as deep as you personally choose. There's one of her books, I do not remember the name, but there's a candle ritual. So each chapter you go through, you light a candle. At the end of it, you say a certain meditation, kind of give yourself a guided tour. I've done that one like 3 times. Each time I have an entirely different experience. It's the same book, same words, but you get a different experience because each time I've done it, it's been 2 to 3 years in between. So you get what you put into it. And that can be said for anything. Wicca, Christianity, Mormonism, Catholicism. You get out of it what you put in. And I'm not talking money, I'm talking time, attention, and focus. So, yeah, we'll just go with that. But like I said, I referenced them down below so you can check them out. And I've said this in multiple book reviews. I've talked about this a lot. Physical is better for the one aspect of You can put notes in it. You can do it with some of the Kindle stuff too, but I like being able to have my handwritten stuff there or underline like this is important. And then if you decide to make your own book, you have an easier access to do that. So something to think about. This massive increase in the hunger for Wicca and witchcraft over the years, though, has led to a lot of movies and TV shows. Imagine that. The movie The Craft, the TV show Charmed, and to a small extent, not so much the coven work, but the magic aspect of it, the Harry Potter series, and they all have aspects of the old path. Not maybe 100%, not in the slightest in some cases, but and they don't always portray magic and the craft in the best light. I'm looking at you, Craft. I love the movie, but you did not do that religion any favors. The end of it did, though. That threefold law aspect came really well into play. So if you were wondering how it can play out, that's the worst case scenario. But they have brought the ancient teachings forward, and it has increased the hunger for more knowledge, different experience type stuff. So a little bit of we'll look at a few numbers here and then we'll wrap this up. In a 2011, let's try that, census in the UK, it was shown that there were over 11,000 people who self-identified as witches or Wiccans, and that was in the UK. In the US, the number in 2014 was estimated to be just over 950,000 people that identified as Wiccan or witches. We're not talking pagans, we're not talking ceremonialists, we're strictly talking about the craft of the wise, going back type thing. Interestingly enough, 4 years later in 2018, the number had been estimated and grown to over 1.5 million people identified as Wiccan or witches. Out of 330 million people in the United States, that's, less than 1%, but that's still impressive. The old religion, the old gods and goddesses, have not been forgotten, nor will they allow themselves to be forgotten. They still are there. They might change their form every now and then, but they're still there. In the first days of the modern covens, people needed to hide beliefs and practices. Over the years, it has been less and less of a shame to call yourself a witch or a Wiccan or someone who follows the spiritual path. Most people don't advertise their beliefs, and I'm over here on YouTube and Odysee like, check this out. But they are not as much fear as there used to be. They may not advertise it, but they're not worried if someone finds out. Today you have most militaries worldwide, not all of them, most, will recognize Wicca as a religion in some way, shape, or form, so they get to have a seat at the table. I believe in the United States it was in 2017, and if I'm wrong, correct me in the chat, please, or comments, but that was one of the first times they acknowledged being able to use a pentagram, upright pentagram, on tombstones as well as the crosses as part of a Wiccan burial service. So you do have some of the stigmas going away. It's not as stigmatized, obviously, as it used to be. There are still those out there, of course there are, that claim that witches are satanic and that Wiccans worship the devil. I'm going to put that to bed, well, at least for people who follow my content or are in my circle of people that I know. Witches are not Satanists, not in the way that I look at them. You have those evil people out there who do dark things, but that's not what I'm talking about. Wiccans do not worship the devil. If you actually understood their beliefs, that's not how things work. And contrary to popular opinion, most Wiccans do believe that there is a source of evil out there. That's a true statement. They don't worship it though. There are some interesting groups out there, one of which is called a Luciferian witch group. They're not based on Gerald Gardner's work in the slightest. They are based, weirdly enough, on Anton LaVey's work. Not all of them, but that's where a lot of them get their source material from. So they're not Wiccans, not in the traditional sense. Personally, don't confuse the two because they're not the same. They might have some similar practices, but they're not the same. So with that, we'll go ahead and wrap this little video up here. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button, drop a like on the video, comment down below, let me know what your thoughts are. If there was anything that I was too far off base on, let me know. As long as we're respectful, that's all I ask for. And with that, I will see you in the next video. Have a great rest of your week, and yeah, happy studies, and enjoy the next full moon. It's coming up about 2 weeks.